Kael'Veth had spent 32 years studying species from behind a desk, and in all that time, he had never once believed the stories about humans. He was Shivari, tall, thin, with bones made of living crystal that hummed faintly when he was nervous. And the Shivari were known across the galaxy for their intelligence, their caution, and their complete inability to throw a punch without shattering their own knuckles. That was fine with Kael'Veth, because he had never needed to punch anything in his life. He was a diplomatic attaché, a professional observer, a being whose entire career was built on watching other species do interesting things, and then writing very detailed reports about it. But standing in the Grand Assembly Chamber of Concord Station Luminarch, watching 34 species argue about whether they were all about to die, he found himself wishing he had learned to fight after all. The war with the Orthon Dominion had been going badly for 2 years. The Orthon were insects, or something close to insects, billion-strong swarms of chitinous, 6-limbed killing machines that could adapt to almost any weapon within a few engagements, and bred faster than anyone could count them. They had seized the Veil Corridor, a chain of critical relay systems that connected the inner Concord worlds to the outer territories, and every attempt to take it back had ended in catastrophe. 3 counteroffensives had failed. The first had been careful and strategic, and the Orthon had eaten it alive. The second had been aggressive and well-funded, and the Orthon had adapted to every weapon the Concord brought, and eaten that one alive too. The third had been desperate, and the less said about it, the better. Now the assembly was screaming at each other in 14 different languages, while the translation systems struggled to keep up, and Kael'Veth stood in the observer gallery, wondering how a civilization that had mastered faster-than-light travel could not master the art of taking turns while speaking. That was when the Terran delegation walked in. There were only 5 of them, which was itself unusual, because most species sent delegations of 20 or more to signal their importance. The humans sent 5. Their leader was a woman named Raya Okonkwo, who held the rank of admiral in the Terran Union Navy, and she walked into that screaming chamber with the calm, unhurried stride of someone who had been in rooms full of panic before and had decided long ago that panic was something that happened to other people. She was not tall by human standards, Kael'Veth would later learn, but she carried herself as though she owned every room she entered and was simply allowing everyone else to use it. The chamber went quiet when she reached the central podium, not because anyone had called for silence, but because something about the way she stood there made noise feel inappropriate. The Terran Union will commit forces to the retaking of the Veil Corridor, she said, and her voice was not loud, but it filled the room the way stone fills a wall, solid and immovable, and very much not interested in your opinion about it. The assembly erupted again, but this time with a different energy, not panic, but confusion mixed with something Kael'Veth could not quite name. Relief, maybe, or maybe fear, because everyone in that room had heard the stories about humans, and nobody could agree on which ones were true. Kael'Veth returned to his quarters that evening and pulled up every classified file the Concord had on the species designated as Terran. He read for 6 hours, and at the end of it, he was more confused than when he started. The files were a mess of contradictions. One report described humans as deeply empathetic, prone to forming emotional bonds with virtually anything, including inanimate objects. Species that have tried to kill them. The next report, written by the same analyst, described them as capable of sustained, calculated violence that exceeds any known behavioral model for a sapient species. A military assessment flagged as reliability uncertain claimed that a single human platoon had held a mining outpost against 400 Orthon warriors for 11 days with no resupply, no reinforcement, and no logical reason to continue fighting. When rescue forces finally arrived, they found the surviving humans, 8 out of 30, sitting among the dead and eating field rations as though nothing particularly interesting had happened. Another file contained a linguistic analysis of human emotional states, and noted that their translators could only approximate one particular emotion that humans apparently felt quite often. The closest translation was spite, defined as the desire to continue doing something, specifically because someone else had tried to prevent it. Wanted you to stop. Kael'Veth read that entry 3 times, and then closed the file because it made his crystal bones itch in a way he did not enjoy. He did not believe most of it. Every young species had myths about itself, stories of impossible bravery and unbreakable will that made good recruiting material, but poor intelligence analysis. Humans had been spacefaring for barely 4 centuries, which in galactic terms made them children, and Kael'Veth had never met a child whose stories about themselves turned out to be entirely accurate. He filed his preliminary assessment. Terran capabilities likely overstated in existing reports due to cultural bias and insufficient sample size. Recommend cautious expectations. 3 days later, he boarded the carrier Luminarch's Vigil to join the combined fleet at the staging area. And that was when he saw the Terran ships for the first time. They were ugly. There was no other word for it. Concord species built their warships with at least some attention to aesthetics. The Draenei favored flowing silver curves, the Velorxi preferred geometric precision, and even the brutish Corrigan managed to make their vessels look intentionally menacing. The Terran ships looked like someone had built a warship, broken it, rebuilt it with whatever was lying around, broken it again, and then bolted extra guns onto the pieces that were still working. Their hulls were scarred and patched and mismatched, and not a single one of them had been polished in what appeared to be living memory. Kael'Veth stood at the observation port, watching them drift into formation, and beside him a Draenei admiral let out a sound of pure aristocratic disgust. "They do not even polish their hulls," the admiral said, as though this were a personal insult directed at his entire bloodline. But on Kael'Veth's other side stood an old Velorxi officer, a veteran of something he never spoke about, and this officer watched the same ugly, battered ships with an expression Kael'Veth had never seen on a Velorxi face before. It looked almost like respect. "They do not need to," the Velorxi said quietly, and then he walked away without explaining what he meant. Kael'Veth stared at the Terran fleet and felt his crystal bones begin to hum. He told himself it was the engine vibrations. He was almost certain he was lying. The invitation to board the Terran dreadnought TUS Defiance came wrapped in the polite language of diplomacy. But Kael'Veth understood what it really was. The humans wanted the Concord observer to see them up close, on their terms, in their territory. He accepted because that was his job, and because he was curious in the way that small animals are curious about large predators, which is to say very carefully and with constant attention to the nearest exit. The Defiance was not what he expected. He had prepared himself for chaos. Humans had a reputation for disorder, for loud voices and cluttered spaces, and a general approach to organization that most species found exhausting. What he found instead was something harder to describe. The ship was clean, but not sterile, organized, but not rigid, and filled with a kind of energy that had no equivalent in the Shivari language. The closest he could come was controlled intensity, spring that knows exactly how much force it contains, and is choosing, for the moment, not to release it. His escort was a young lieutenant named Vasquez, who smiled too much and talked too fast, and seemed genuinely delighted to have an alien visitor aboard, which Kael'Veth found both charming and slightly alarming. Vasquez led him through corridors where human crew members moved with purpose and nodded greetings as they passed, and eventually brought him to the training deck, where a company of Terran Marines was running combat drills. Kael'Veth had to stop in the doorway and hold on to the frame. The gravity was wrong. Not wrong exactly. It was Earth standard, 1 full G, which was the gravity humans had evolved in, and which they maintained on all their warships, because their bodies needed it to stay strong. For a Shivari, 1 G was agony, It pulled at his crystal bones like invisible hands trying to snap them, made his joints scream, turned every step into a negotiation with pain. For humans, it was Tuesday. He watched them from behind a reinforced observation window, his bones humming with distress, as 30 Marines in full combat gear ran and rolled and fought and threw each other across the deck with a speed and violence that made his stomach turn. A sergeant, a woman whose arms were thicker than Kael'Veth's legs, hit a training dummy so hard that it cracked down the middle and pieces of it skittered across the floor. She shook her hand once, grinned, and then turned around and saw a young recruit who had stumbled and fallen. She walked over and offered her hand with a gentleness that did not match anything Kael'Veth had just witnessed, and she pulled the recruit to his feet and said something that made him laugh, and then she went back to destroying things. Kael'Veth made a note in his file. Humans contain contradictions the way oceans contain water. It is not a feature of them, but the fundamental substance of which they are made. Later that day, he attended the joint strategy session in the Defiance's war room, where the admirals of 7 species gathered around a holographic map of the Vile Corridor and argued about how to take it back. The Concord admirals favored caution, probing attacks, slow advances, careful management of casualties, because every species in the room had learned the hard way that the Orthan punished aggression and adapted to repeated tactics. Admiral Okonkwo listened to all of it without speaking. She sat at the end of the table, with her hands folded and her face perfectly still, and Kael'Veth could not tell if she was patient or simply waiting for everyone else to finish being wrong. When silence finally came, she stood and changed the holographic display with a single gesture. Instead of the layered, cautious approach the others had proposed, her plan showed a single massive thrust, the entire Terran vanguard driving straight through the Orthon defensive lines and into the heart of the hive node on Vale Prime. Cut the head off the swarm. The room exploded. A Draenei admiral called it reckless, and a Corrigan general called it insane, and even the quiet Moldari representative made a sound that the translators rendered as absolute madness. The casualty projections alone were enough to make Kael'Veth feel sick. The plan essentially guaranteed that a significant portion of the vanguard force would not survive the initial engagement. Okonkwo waited for the noise to die down, and then she said something that Kael'Veth would remember for the rest of his life. "You are projecting Orthon casualties onto human soldiers," she said, and her voice was calm and even and absolutely certain. "We do not break the same way." Nobody had an answer for that. The meeting ended without resolution, but Kael'Veth could feel the weight of what had just happened, settling over the room like dust after a detonation. He spent the rest of the evening wandering the Defiance, talking to crew members, trying to understand what he had seen. Most of them were friendly and open, and seemed to find his confusion entertaining in a kind way, and they answer his questions with the easy honesty of people who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. It was in the lower observation deck that he found Corporal Tomas Reyes. Reyes was young, maybe 25 in human years, with dark eyes and a quiet way of holding himself that reminded Kael'Veth of deep water, still on the surface and unknowable underneath. He was sitting alone, looking at the stars, and on his forearm was a tattoo of a planet surrounded by a ring of small stars. Kael'Veth asked about it. "That is Nueva Esperanza," Reyes said, and his voice was soft and steady. It was a colony world in the outer territories. About 40,000 people, mostly farmers, and engineers and their families. He paused. The Orthan burned it 2 years ago. The whole thing, atmosphere and all. There was nothing left to bury. Kael'Veth did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which turned out to be the right choice. Reyes looked at him and smiled, and it was the kind of smile that had weight to it, the kind that cost something to wear. "I had a sister there," he said. "Her name was Lucia, and she was studying to be a teacher, and she was afraid of thunderstorms, which is funny when you think about it, because she moved to a planet that had them every afternoon. Kael'theth asked him if he was afraid of the coming battle. Reyes thought about it for a long time. "Yeah," he said finally. "Yeah, I am scared, but the thing is I am more angry than scared, and humans, we run pretty well on anger." 3 days later, the Concord voted on the battle plan. They adopted a compromise, a broader assault, multiple axes of approach. But they gave the Terran forces the vanguard, the very tip of the spear, the position that would hit the enemy first and hardest, and absorb the worst of the fighting. Every species in the room understood what that meant. The humans were being given the most dangerous role, not because they were the best, but because they were the most expendable. The newest species, the smallest fleet, the ones whose loss would cost the Concord the least. And the humans knew it. Kael'theth watched Admiral Okonkwo's face when the vote was announced, and he saw something flicker across it. Not anger, not surprise, but a kind of tired recognition, the expression of someone who had been underestimated before and had learned to use it. She accepted the vanguard without hesitation. And Kael'theth sat in that chamber full of ancient, powerful, sophisticated species, and realized that not one of them understood what they had just done. Given humans the most dangerous job, they had given humans a reason. The fleet entered faster-than-light transit at dawn by station time, and the countdown to battle began. 14 hours until they dropped into the Veil Corridor. 14 hours until everything became real, in a way that no amount of planning could prepare anyone for. Kael'theth could not sleep. He had returned to the Luminarch's vigil after his time aboard the Defiance. But the Concord carrier felt different now. Too quiet, too clean, too much like a place where people went to avoid thinking about what was coming. So he requested a shuttle back to the Defiance, and this time, when he stepped aboard the human ship, he did not grab the doorframe against the gravity. He barely noticed it. He told himself it was because he was getting used to it, and not because something inside him had decided that a little pain was a small price to pay for whatever truth was waiting on the other side of that hull. The ship was awake. Not loud, not frantic, but awake. In every corner and corridor in a way that reminded Kael'theth of a heartbeat. Steady and persistent, and fundamentally alive. He wandered without direction, letting the ship guide him, and what he found in those 14 hours changed everything he thought he knew about the species called human. In a narrow corridor on Deck 7, he found a Marine sitting cross-legged on the floor, with a piece of actual paper on his knee and a pen in his hand. The Marine was writing a letter. Not a digital message, not a recorded hologram, but a physical letter written by hand on paper that he would fold and seal and leave in a locker marked with his name and his family's address, so that if he did not come home, there would be something left of him that his hands had touched. Kael'theth stopped and stared. The Marine looked up and smiled and said, "Old tradition, goes back thousands of years to when we first started sending soldiers to places they might not come back from. The idea is that if the worst happens, your family gets something real, something you held, not just data on a screen." Kael'theth asked if many of the crew were writing letters. The Marine laughed softly and said, "All of us." He walked on and turned a corner and nearly walked into a line of humans waiting to enter a cargo bay on Deck 12. The bay had been converted into a chapel, or rather several chapels pressed together into one space. On one side, a Christian chaplain read from a book so old it looked like it might fall apart if anyone breathed on it too hard. On another side, a Muslim Marine knelt on a small rug and prayed toward a direction that had been calculated relative to Earth's position, even though Earth was hundreds of light years away. In the center, a Buddhist monk sat in silence next to a Hindu woman who was chanting softly, and near the back, a Marine with no apparent faith at all, was simply sitting with his eyes closed and his hands on his knees, breathing. And the part that made Kael'theth's crystal bones sing with a frequency he had never felt before was that when the prayers were done, they reached for each other. Hands clasped across faiths, across cultures, across every line that humans had ever drawn between themselves. A Marine who prayed to one god held the hand of a Marine who prayed to another, and they squeezed once and let go and walked out together. Kael'theth made no notes because he did not trust his hands to hold a datapad steady. He moved on and found the mess hall, and this was where his understanding of humans broke apart completely and reassembled itself into something new. They were laughing. 40 Marines packed into a room designed for 20, eating food that smelled aggressively of spices Kael'theth could not identify, and they were laughing so hard that some of them could barely breathe. A massive sergeant was telling a story that seemed to involve a training accident and someone's pants, and a small alien creature that had gotten loose on a ship. And every time he reached what was apparently the funny part, the room erupted into howling and table-slapping and the kind of full-body joy that Kael'theth had only ever associated with celebrations, not with the hours before potential death. He stood in the doorway, and a lieutenant noticed him and waved him in, and someone shoved a plate of food toward him, and someone else poured him a drink that smelled like it could dissolve metal. He asked the lieutenant why they were not solemn, why they were not quiet and reflective and afraid. She looked at him with eyes that were bright with laughter, and something underneath the laughter that was older and deeper and much more serious. "This is how we are solemn," she said. "If I spend my last night alive crying, then the Orthon already won. They took my colony, and they took my friends, but they do not get to take this. They do not get to take the part of me that can still laugh." Kael'theth drank whatever was in the cup, and it burned all the way down, and he laughed too, though he was not entirely sure why. Later, when the mess hall had quieted, and the Marines had drifted away to their bunks and their letters and their private silences, Kael'theth found Corporal Reyes on the observation deck again. Reyes was looking at the strange smeared light of faster-than-light travel, and his face was calm in a way that went beyond the absence of fear. It was the face of someone who had already made peace with every possible version of tomorrow. "Can I ask you something?" Kael'theth said. "You have been asking me things since we met," Reyes said with a small smile. "Why stop now? Your species, you have only been in space for 400 years, and yet you fight as if war is something you have known forever. Where does it come from?" Reyes was quiet for a while. "Comes from Earth," he said, "from before we ever left it. We spent most of our history fighting each other. Thousands of years of it. War after war after war. It is in our mythology and our music and our art and the names of our cities and the monuments we build. We hate it, Kael'theth. We really do. But it is in us the way your crystals are in you, deep down in the bones." He turned and looked at the Shivari, and his dark eyes were steady. "Evolution made us persistence predators. Did you know that? On our homeworld, we used to hunt by chasing animals until they collapsed from exhaustion, because we could keep going longer than anything else alive. We are not the fastest, and we are not the strongest, but we do not stop." He said it simply, without pride, the way someone might describe the color of the sky. We do not stop. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at 0600 hours. Battle stations sounded across every ship in the combined fleet, a wailing alarm on Concord vessels, a deep, thunderous horn on the Corrigan battleships, a series of precise tones on the Drenai cruisers. On the Terran ships, the alarm was a single, low, steady note that sounded less like a warning and more like a promise. Kael'theth stood on the observation deck of the Vigil and watched the fleet spread into formation, hundreds of ships from dozens of species, arranging themselves into the pattern that would carry them into battle. And then the Terran ships began to broadcast. It took him a moment to understand what he was hearing, because it was not tactical communication, and it was not a battle cry, and it was not anything the Concorde had a protocol for. It was music. Drums first, deep, rolling, thunderous drums that seemed to come from the belly of something ancient. Then brass, bright and fierce, climbing above the drums like fire climbing a wall. Then strings and voices, and instruments Calveth had no name. 4. Layered together in a wave of sound that rolled across the fleet's communication channels like a tide coming in. It was not one song, but many, a dozen different anthems from a dozen different human cultures, woven together into something that should have been chaos, but was instead a single, unified, roaring declaration of intent. The Concorde fleet went silent. Every species on every ship stopped what they were doing and listened. Even the Orthon, whose forward scouts had begun transmitting challenge signals, went quiet for 17 seconds, which was the longest the insectoid swarm had ever paused for anything. And through the music, through the drums and the brass, and the ancient voices singing in languages that predated spaceflight, Calveth heard a new sound, rhythmic, steady, growing louder. Boots. 40,000 human marines, sealing their helmets and marching to their dropships in perfect unison, their boots hitting the deck together. In a sound that was not quite music, and not quite war, and not quite prayer, but somehow all three at once. The sound traveled through the hulls of the Terran ships, and across the communication channels, and into the bones of every being in the fleet. Calveth felt it in his crystal skeleton like a second heartbeat. And he understood. He finally understood what the old Velarxy officer had meant, and what the files had failed to capture, and what no report or analysis or intelligence assessment could ever contain. This was not a species going to war. This was a species that had been going to war since before it could write its own name, that had carried the memory of every battle in its blood and its songs and the rhythm of its marching feet, and that had looked at the stars and found the same thing it had always found everywhere it went, something worth fighting for. He opened his diplomatic log, and with shaking hands, he changed humanity's species. Classification. He deleted moderate conventional threat, and typed 3 words he had never used in 32 years of service. Apex threat, allied. Then he closed the log and stood at the observation window and watched the humans march into the dark. His bones were humming, and for the first time, he did not tell himself it was the engines. The Battle of the Veil Corridor began at 6:14 hours, and by 6:20, everything had already gone wrong. The Orthan had reinforced, massively, impossibly, in numbers that made the Concorde intelligence estimates look like a joke someone had told at a party that nobody found funny. Where the analysts had predicted 800 warships, there were 2,000, and where they had predicted ground forces in the low millions, there were swarms so dense that the orbital scanners could not count individual organisms, and instead displayed the surface of Veil Prime as a single shifting mass of chitin and rage. The Concorde flanks buckled within the first hour. The Drenai cruisers on the left wing took concentrated fire from a formation of Orthan interceptors that should not have existed, according to every model the Concorde had built, and the beautiful silver ships cracked and burned and tumbled into the dark. On the right wing, the Corrigan battleships, massive, heavy cruisers, were immobilized by an overwhelming wave of enemy missile fire, consumed by a firestorm that left the sector a charred, silent expanse. Heavily armored vessels, crewed by beings who prided themselves on their ferocity, lasted 40 minutes longer before their commander ordered a retreat that was really a rout dressed in better language. 2 other species broke formation entirely, their ships scattering like startled birds, and the communication channels filled with panic in a dozen languages as the carefully planned assault fell apart. And through it all, in the center of the formation, at the very tip of the spear, The Terran vanguard did not stop. Admiral Okonkwo's voice came across the fleet channel exactly once. All Terran elements, forward. Not hold the line or maintain position, or any of the careful measured orders that the Concord tactical manuals recommended for moments of crisis. Forward, into the thickest concentration of Orthan forces anyone had ever seen, into the swarm that had just broken two flanks of a galactic alliance, into the kind of fire that turned ships into expanding clouds of debris and memory. The Defiance led the charge, and Kael'Veth watched from the Vigil's tactical display as the Dreadnought's signature plowed into the Orthon formation like a fist through glass. Terran ships began taking hits immediately. Not glancing blows, but deep structural damage that would have sent any Concord vessel limping toward the rear. And they kept going. The destroyer TUS Gallipoli took a concentrated barrage that tore away the entire port side of its hull, and Kael'Veth watched the ship's signature flicker and stutter, and thought it was done, thought it was over, thought he was watching 800 humans die in the cold. The Gallipoli fired its engines. Half a ship, trailing atmosphere and debris and flame, and it fired its engines and accelerated toward Vale Prime, and delivered its entire marine complement to the surface in a combat drop that the tactical computers rated as having a 0% survival probability for the vessel. The Marines made it to the ground. The Gallipoli broke apart 11 seconds later. Kael'Veth stared at the display, and a Concord tactical officer beside him whispered, "What are they?" And Kael'Veth had no answer, because every answer he could think of felt insufficient. On the surface of Vale Prime, the situation was worse. Kael'Veth monitored the battle through Concord drone feeds, watching from above as human Marines fought their way through a landscape that was more nightmare than geography. The Orthon had reshaped the planet's surface into a maze of tunnels and hive structures and killing grounds designed to channel invaders into ambush after ambush. The atmosphere was toxic, laced with chemical compounds the Orthon used to communicate and coordinate, and it ate through standard Concord environmental suits in minutes. The human Marines had modified their gear to handle it, because of course they had. Looked at a planet covered in poison and acid-blooded aliens, and thought, yes, but have we tried going there anyway? He watched a squad push through a collapsed tunnel, under fire so heavy that the drone's audio sensors registered it as a single continuous sound rather than individual impacts. A sergeant, not the one from the training deck, a different one, though he was beginning to think all human sergeants were cut from the same terrifying cloth, took a barbed Orthon spine through her left shoulder. The spine was 1/2 meter long and designed to inject paralytic venom that could drop a Corrigan in seconds. The sergeant looked down at the spine sticking out of her shoulder and grabbed it with her free hand and snapped off the protruding end and kept shooting. Her squad did not even pause. They stepped over Orthon dead and pushed forward as though the concept of retreat was a word in a language they had never learned and had no interest in. Kael'Veth felt his crystal bones vibrating at a frequency that was either awe or terror, and he suspected it might be both. The Orthon adapted. They always adapted. It was what made them the most dangerous enemy the galaxy had ever faced. And within hours, they had begun targeting human weak points with surgical precision. They aimed for joints and eyes, and the gaps in armor plating, and they deployed chemical agents specifically designed to attack human biology, and for a brief, terrible window, the advance stalled, and Kael'Veth thought that the line had finally broken, that the humans had found the limit of what flesh and fury could accomplish. He was wrong. The humans adapted back. Not in the way the Orthon adapted, through biological mutation and hive mind coordination, but in a way that was entirely and uniquely human, through communication and creativity, and the sheer stubborn refusal to let the enemy write the rules. Shifted in real time as sergeants and corporals and even privates made decisions on the ground, without waiting for orders from above. They used the Orthon's own tunnels against them, collapsing passages to create choke points and flooding chambers with incendiary compounds that turned the hive's infrastructure into a weapon. They learned the layout of the hive node during the assault, not before it, not from intelligence briefings, but by fighting through it room by room and relaying what they found to every other unit in the field through a communication network that never stopped transmitting, even when the soldiers using it were bleeding and broken. The Orthon had never encountered anything like it. They could adapt to weapons, and they could adapt to tactics, but they could not adapt to a species that treated adaptation itself as a competitive sport. Corporal Tomas Reyes was part of the force that breached the inner hive, almost by accident, cycling through dozens of channels, looking for an overview of the battle. And suddenly there was Reyes on his screen, covered in dust and ichor and blood that was partly his own, moving through a corridor of living chitin toward the center of the hive node, where the Orthon Queen General waited. The Queen General was enormous, a command organism the size of a small building, encased in layers of adaptive armor that had evolved specifically to resist every weapon the Concord had ever deployed, and connected to the neural network that coordinated every Orthon soldier on the planet and in orbit. Kill the Queen General, and the swarm would lose coordination and collapse into chaos. The corridor leading to her was a killing ground. Reyes' squad entered it at 12 soldiers strong, and by the time they reached the inner chamber, they were 4. Kael'Veth watched Reyes take a hit to the leg that should have put him down, watched him stumble and catch himself on the wall and keep moving, watched him take another hit across the ribs that painted the inside of his visor red. The Queen General's guards swarmed the remaining soldiers, and Kael'Veth watched 3 more fall in seconds. And then it was just Reyes, alone, bleeding from wounds he probably could not count, dragging himself across the floor of the inner chamber toward the Queen General's neural cluster with a demolition charge in his hand. The Queen General turned her massive head and looked at him, and for one frozen moment, the most powerful Orthon commander in the Veil Corridor and a single broken human marine stared at each other across 10 meters of blood-slicked floor. Reyes' helmet camera was still transmitting. Kael'Veth heard him whisper a single word: Lucia, the name of his sister who had been afraid of thunderstorms on a world the Orthon had burned. Then Reyes activated the charge. The feed cut to static. Neural cluster was destroyed, and the effect was immediate and devastating. Across the entire planet and throughout the orbital battlespace, the Orthon swarm lost coordination. Ships that had been executing precise attack patterns began flying blind, crashing into each other and into the planet's atmosphere. Ground forces that had been fighting with terrifying efficiency dissolved into disorganized mobs that the surviving human marines cut apart with mechanical precision. The Concord flanks, seeing the swarm collapse, rallied and pushed forward, and within 6 hours, the Veil Corridor was retaken. Kael'Veth sat in front of the blank screen where Reyes' feed had been, and did not move for a very long time. The casualty reports came in over the next several hours. The Terran Vanguard had suffered 62% losses. More than half the humans who had marched to their dropships that morning would not be marching back. Kael'Veth had studied military history across 40 species, and he knew of no force in galactic record that had continued fighting, continued advancing, after losses of that magnitude. The humans mourned their dead. He heard them through the communication channels. Not wailing, not screaming, but quiet voices saying names and sharing memories, and occasionally laughing at things the dead had said or done, because apparently humans honored their fallen by remembering them as they had lived, rather than as they had died. And then before the day was over, before the bodies had been recovered and the wounded had been stabilized and the blood had been cleaned from the decks, Admiral Okonkwo's staff began planning the next operation. Kael'Veth received a message on his diplomatic channel. The Concord Council was calling a special session. The topic was the reclassification of humanity's threat level and diplomatic status. Message for a long time. And in the darkness of his quarters, his crystal bones hummed with a sound like grief and wonder, and something he was only beginning to understand. The Grand Assembly Chamber on Concord Station Luminarch was designed to hold representatives of 34 species in comfort and dignity, with carefully calibrated lighting and atmospheric zones and seating arrangements that respected the biological needs of every known civilization in the Alliance. On the day Kael'Veth stood at the central podium, the chamber held representatives of 34 species, and not a single one of them looked comfortable. He could feel them watching him, hundreds of eyes and optical sensors and chemical receptors, all focused on one tall, thin Shivari with crystal bones that would not stop humming. He had been asked to deliver his observational report on human combat capabilities, to provide the data and analysis that would inform the Council's decision about what to do with humanity now that the Veil Corridor had been retaken and the galaxy had seen what Terran soldiers could do. Several species had already made their positions clear before the session began. The Draenei wanted restrictions, hard limits on the size of the Terran fleet, on their colonial expansion, on their access to advanced Concord technology. Their argument was elegant and logical, and it went like this. Any species that could absorb 62% casualties and continue advancing was not an ally, but a future threat, a weapon that happened to be pointed at the enemy today, but could be pointed anywhere tomorrow. The Moldarai supported the Draenei, as did the Tessari and the Ven, and their combined voting bloc represented enough of the Council to push the measure through if nobody objected. Kael'Veth understood their fear. He had felt it himself, standing on the observation deck of the Vigil, watching those battered, ugly ships drive into the swarm. But understanding fear and agreeing with it were not the same thing, and in the 3 weeks since the battle, he had spent every waking hour thinking about what he had seen and what it meant, and he had arrived at a conclusion that his 32 years of careful diplomatic analysis had not prepared him for. He had prepared a report. It was exactly what everyone expected from a Shivari: thorough, detailed, annotated, filled with data points and statistical models and risk projections, formatted in the precise analytical style that the Concord valued above all else. He carried it to the podium in a datapad, and set it down and looked out at the assembly, and then he set the datapad aside. He did not use it. "I was sent to observe humans," he said, and his voice echoed in the chamber's perfect acoustics. "I was sent to assess whether the stories about them were true, whether their reputation was earned or manufactured, whether they were the soldiers the galaxy needed or the threat the galaxy feared." He paused and let the silence settle. "I have my answer, but it is not the answer I expected, and it is not in the report I prepared, because the report contains data, and what I need to tell you cannot be measured." The Draenei ambassador shifted in her seat with the particular expression her species wore when they suspected someone was about to be emotional in a professional setting. Kael'Veth did not care. "In the hours before the battle," he said, "I walked through a human warship, and I watched soldiers write letters, physical letters, on paper, with their own hands, to families they believed they might never see again. This is a tradition among humans that stretches back thousands of years, older than their spaceflight, older than their electricity, older than their written language perhaps, the act of leaving something behind that your hands have touched, so that the people who love you will have proof that you were real. I watched them pray, not to one God but to many, side by side in the same room, and when they were done praying, they held each other's hands regardless of what name they used for the divine, because in those final hours, the differences between their faiths mattered less than the fact that they were all about to walk into the same fire. I sat in their mess hall, and I watched them laugh, and I asked a lieutenant why they were not afraid, and she told me that laughter was how humans were solemn, that if she spent her last night alive in tears, then the enemy had already won, because they could take her world and her friends, but they could not take the part of her that still knew how to find joy. He could feel the chamber changing around him, not physically, but in the quality of the attention, the weight of it, as dozens of species stopped thinking about politics and started listening. I spoke with a young Marine named Corporal Tomas Reyes, Calveth said, and the name felt heavy in his mouth, sacred in a way he could not fully explain. He had a tattoo of a planet on his arm, Nueva Esperanza, a colony. The Orthan had burned. 40,000 people, including his sister Lucia, who was studying to be a teacher and was afraid of thunderstorms. He told me he was afraid of the battle, and he told me he was angry, and he said that humans run well on anger. 3 days later he crawled through a corridor full of Orthan warriors, with half the blood in his body on the outside of it, and he destroyed the Queen General's neural cluster with a demolition charge, and the last word he spoke was his sister's name. The chamber was completely silent. "You are afraid of humans," Calveth said, and he looked directly at the Draenei ambassador, because someone had to. "You are afraid of them because they can absorb losses that would break any other species and keep fighting, because they are strong and fast and adaptable, and because they carry war in their bones like a memory they cannot erase. You want to restrict them, to cage them, to put limits on their fleet and their colonies and their technology, because you looked at what they did in the Veil Corridor, and you saw a threat. I looked at the same thing, and I saw something different." He took a breath, and his crystal bones rang with a clear high note that carried through the chamber's acoustics like a bell. "You are afraid of humans because they can fight. You should be in awe of them because they choose to grieve. Every species in this chamber calculates acceptable losses. It is built into your military doctrine and your strategic planning and your cost-benefit analyses. You decide in advance how many of your soldiers you are willing to spend, and when the price becomes too high, you stop. Humans do not calculate acceptable losses. They do not accept any losses. They simply refuse to let loss stop them. That is not madness. That is love expressed through fury." Corporal Reyes did not crawl through that corridor because he wanted to die. He crawled through it because his sister had been afraid of thunderstorms, and someone had burned her sky, and he could not live in a galaxy where that went unanswered. That is what you are afraid of. Not their strength, not their endurance, not their capacity for violence. You are afraid of how much they love, because you have never seen a species that loves so hard it looks like war. He turned to face the full assembly. "My recommendation is as follows. Humanity should not be restricted. Humanity should not be caged or limited or contained. Humanity should be granted full founding partner status in the Galactic Concord with permanent seats on this council." The chamber erupted, but Calveth raised his voice above it. "You do not cage the species that bled for you. You stand beside them, because I promise you this, on my name and the name of my house, and every crystal in my body. If you turn on them, if you betray the soldiers who died to save your worlds, you make enemies of the species that just broke the Orthon dominion for you. Then you will learn what the Orthon learned. Humans do not forget, and they do not stop." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Calveth had ever heard. Then, from the back of the chamber, an old Valorxy officer stood. It was the same officer from the observation deck on the first day, the one who had watched the Terran ships arrive, and said they do not need to, when the Draenei admiral complained about their unpolished hulls. He had never spoken in an assembly session before. He stood and he looked at Calveth, and he nodded once, with the slow gravity of someone who had waited a very long time for someone else to say what he had always known. "I second the motion," he said. One by one, species joined. The Corrigan general who had called Okonkwo's plan insane stood and voted in favor, and his face had the expression of someone who had learned something they were not entirely comfortable with, but could not deny. The Moldari, who had supported restrictions, changed their vote without explanation. Even the Draenei ambassador, after a pause so long that the chamber began to murmur, stood and said, "The Draenei sovereignty withdraws its objection," in a voice that was stiff with pride, but honest in its surrender. The motion passed with 31 votes in favor, and 3 abstentions, and 0 votes against. Kael'thas left the podium on legs that trembled so badly, his crystal bones sounded like wind chimes, and he did not stop walking until he reached his quarters, where he sat down on his bunk and shook for an hour. 3 weeks later he took a shuttle to Vale Prime. The planet was still scarred, and poisoned, and broken. But in the center of the main landing zone, the Terran Union had built a memorial, a wall of black stone, polished smooth, stretching 100 meters in each direction. It were names. Thousands and thousands of human names, etched in white letters against the black. Each one a person who had marched into those dropships and never marched out. Kael'thas walked along the wall slowly, reading names he could not pronounce, and about halfway along he found the one he was looking for. Corporal Tomas Reyes, Terran Union Marine Corps, Nueva Esperanza. And beneath his name, in smaller letters that someone had carved by hand, not by machine, with the rough, uneven strokes of a blade held in shaking fingers. Lucia Reyes, teacher, beloved. Kael'thas stood in front of those 2 names, and the wind of Vale Prime moved across his crystal bones and made them sing. A human officer found him there some time later. How long he could not say, because time had become unreliable in the way it does when grief and gratitude occupy the same space. She was young, with red hair and tired eyes, and she wore the same battered armor that every human marine seemed to live in. "Did you know him?" she asked. "No," Kael'thas said, "but I will remember him." She nodded, and there was something in the nod that crossed every boundary between their species, not translator-mediated, not culturally interpreted, but pure and direct and understood in the way that some things are understood by every living being that has ever loved someone and lost them. They stood together in silence, and the wind sang through Kael'thas' bones, and somewhere far away, a species that had been marching since before it had a name for the stars, continued to march, not because it wanted to, but because it remembered every name on every wall and refused, with the particular stubbornness that only humans possess, to let a single one of them be forgotten. That night, in his quarters aboard the transport that carried him home, Kael'thas opened his diplomatic log for the final time, and recorded his last entry on the subject of the species designated Terran. "I was sent to observe whether humans deserve their galactic reputation," he wrote. "They do. Not because they are warriors, though they are the finest warriors I have ever seen. Not because they are strong, though they are stronger than any species their size has a right to be. Not because they are stubborn, though their stubbornness borders on a fundamental force of physics. They deserve their reputation because they are warriors who weep, because they write letters before battle, and laugh in the shadow of death, and hold the hands of strangers who pray to different gods. Because a young man with his sister's name on his lips crawled through hell to save a galaxy that had sent him there as an afterthought. The galaxy has never seen anything more terrifying or more beautiful than a species that loves so deeply it will burn the stars to protect what it cherishes. Exaggerated. If anything, it is insufficient." He closed the log and turned off the light, and lay in the darkness, listening to his crystal bones hum with a frequency he now recognized. It was not fear, and it was not awe, and it was not the engines. It was gratitude. And somewhere across the void, on 100 ships and 1,000 worlds, the humans marched on.